About some of the day's news as well as what to expect when Parliament returns next week with our next guest, Liberal MP up in Brisbane there, Andrew Lammin. He joins us now live. Thanks for your company.
Great to be with you, Peter.
Do you welcome the Prime Minister pretty substantially, I have to say, on morning radio today with Alan Jones, opening the door to GST reform, the GST going up to 15%, broadening to apply to all goods, including fresh foods, but making the point, of course, that his interest in that is as long as the overall tax burden doesn't increase, but recognising the need to shift towards more consumption taxes rather than income taxes.
Well, you're seeing an interesting mid-election term period for this government, determining what it will fight for at the next election, what it's prepared to go into battle over. And if that's going to be jobs, that's, I think, a successful formula. You've just heard that from the Prime Minister. And you've got to be unapologetic about that. Look, tax reform, we're looking back at 1998 when John Howard did something similar in a difficult first term. So I think you may be looking at these two frontiers for the next election emerging this week prior to going back to Canberra.
Do you think that's a good thing? Are you a strong supporter of that sort of taxation and, I guess, to go hand in glove with it, federation reform?
I'm probably a pessimist in this area. I think that, you know, in a pragmatic sense, it's going to be enormously difficult and complicated. We need a very simple re-election message next year, and turning a tax message into a simple one requires the greatest of political powers. I think the jobs message is a bit more compelling, to be honest. I think the Coalition has got it right on big mining projects, right on Greg Hunt's approval of $1 trillion of projects. That's easy to understand. Removing red and green tape for business, I really think that will be the success or fail for the Coalition.
So does that mean you've got some concerns about the government's capacity to, in the modern age, deliver on that kind of mammoth GST-style project along the lines that John Howard did in '98?
It's probably a unique achievement of John Howard's, but we are in a very similar position to that first Howard term.
You mean in terms of problems in the polls and all the rest of it?
Exactly. Sure, a very, very rough first term for Howard, well behind in the polls. So there are certain similarities there, but I think we've got to give the Prime Minister all of this year to finesse the tax message. He's got, I think, premiers who are staring down the barrel just how tough these next few years are, a falling Australian dollar, remarkably stable unemployment rate. We haven't slipped up to the 11% headline rate of Europe. The US is showing us the way, a very, very liquid market that can release workers and rehire them quickly. The US proved us completely wrong. They blindsided us with their GFC recovery and their fall in unemployment. We need to be taking lessons. I know we don't like doing it from the US, but to have unemployment where it is in the US at the moment is pretty inspiring.
When you say we need to give the Prime Minister the rest of this year, is that you trying to make a pretty loud message, I suppose, that he asked for 6 months after the February spill, but we've gone beyond that now? You think it's a reasonable thing to give him more time, give him till the end of the year, particularly, obviously, if something like tax reform and as substantial as that gets thrown into the mix for the rest of the year?
There's no one I know who would disagree with that. Everyone would say that the budget was effective this year. We were cruising well until the distractions of 6 weeks ago. But what I have appreciated, I think, is that the Prime Minister has started to make it utterly clear that this is a fight about jobs. And the longer this free trade agreement debate goes on and the more Labor premiers side with Tony Abbott, the more this makes it extremely difficult for Bill Shorten, who's had a very easy run over the last 6 to 12 months. Being on the wrong side of this China free trade agreement is going to hurt, because his only friends are hypothetical electricians who think they won't get a job on major projects. Increasingly, that's not a significant enough reason to block a free trade agreement with China. Australians can see the billions of dollars that will flow. One-fifth of the world's population. We're either in this game with China or we're out, and I don't think they like seeing an opposition leader folding and walking away from the table because of union wishes for electricians in remote projects.
Well, I have to say, you didn't sound very convincing over there in Canning just earlier in the afternoon discussing that. I want to come back to the free trade agreement with you in a moment, but just to rule a line under the GST, it sounds like you've got some concerns about the idea of fighting that type of election campaign. I remember in '98, it's Arthur Sinodinos, when I interviewed him as John Howard's Chief of Staff at the time for the Howard biography, he felt that that was the issue that saved the John Howard government and saved John Howard. It gave him something firm to fight for. It doesn't sound like you're convinced, though, that in the here and now, very different times, nearly 2 decades on, that sort of tax reform is the right thing for your government to be fighting for.
Look, I'm just observing that it's an incredibly complicated front to take on as a government, but no, I'm optimistic if we can find the simple cutting message in tax. That's great, but certainly I think jobs is Tony Abbott's winner, and you just saw before, this is working beautifully for him, you know, finding the diamond within, pushing up workforce participation even in the face of shocking bulk commodity price falls. The fact we've still got unemployment, you know, around the high fives is extraordinary achievement. So if we can keep working on that, then the green shoots can follow. I'm just more optimistic about the jobs front than I'm about tax, but just call me a bit of a pragmatic pessimist. I'm certainly there to support the Prime Minister if we can get the message right.
Okay, on the free trade agreement, which we were talking about just before, help me with this. I mean, I'm a huge advocate of free trade. It looks like Labor premiers and Labor opposition leaders are lining up to support it, which is putting them at odds with Bill Shorten, it would seem. But the big thing that federal Labor seems to have a problem with is the MOU, this wording in the MOU of there will be no requirement for labour market testing to enter into an investment facilitation agreement. They're worried what that does to local jobs versus foreign jobs coming in. I guess the one question I have as a concern about the free trade agreement is to say, well, if that's not the concern that the government says that it's not, and has said abundantly and over again that it's not, why do we need to leave it in the MOU? Why not do what Labor says and just have it removed?
Well, first of all, we don't get to nickel and dime free trade agreements. They're presented to us as a whole. And this MOU, otherwise referred to also the IFA, doesn't go into this detail, but it simply allows a project that's Chinese funded to apply for the 457 visas where all the rules will apply.
Right.
So the IFA is full of a certain language saying that there's no testing at that point, but we're giving a conditional okay to a Chinese project to apply for the 457s when they need them and know that they'll be in the game under existing rules, and that has a three-step Labor test to it. So it's not in the IFA, but Andrew Robb would explain that the 457 visa has these three tests of demonstrating, assessing and testing labour market availability before a 457 is issued. Now, Roy Hill and Gina Rinehart wanted 2,000 foreign workers to come in and do concrete formwork under the Labor government, and they processed that application with no problem. But as soon as it's China, they're taking a different tune, and that is the hypocrisy of Labor. The testing of the market occurs for the 457 visa, and sure, a minister can change conditions of a 457, but they always have, they always will. Nothing has changed for China, and I think that is Tony Abbott and Andrew Robb's message.
Yep, and in fairness to Tony Abbott and Andrew Laming, the same thing applied in relation to the agreement with Chile, the same thing applied in relation to the agreement across ASEAN. So what's different with China? We're out of time. We appreciate you joining us, as always, on Newsday. Thanks for your company, Andrew Laming.
Great to be with you.
All right, we're going to take you live now to some pictures in